The sun over Cedar Ridge wasn't just hot, it was personal. It baked the dirt into a cracked, desperate puzzle and bleached the hope right out of the sky. It was 1873, and Margaret Sullivan felt every single degree of that heat in her bones. She stood in the doorway of a cabin that was more splinters than wood, watching her 4-year-old son Thomas sketch ghosts in the dust with a twig. The boy was a whisper of a child, swimming in clothes that were more patched than fabric. Margaret herself was 23, but the cracked piece of mirror inside told her she was staring at a woman of 30, maybe older. Time moved different when you were starving. Her husband James had been gone 14 months. A wagon wheel at the lumber mill had made her a widow and an outcast in one brutal, splintering second. The town's charity had run out faster than the water in the creek bed. Now the good women of Cedar Ridge, like the banker's wife, Mrs. Henderson, would physically cross the street to avoid her. They'd pull their skirts tight, as if poverty was a plague you could catch on the breeze. Margaret was used to the whispers. She takes in laundry from the saloon girls. She talks to the Mexican traders. She's too pretty to be a widow for long without finding trouble. The whispers followed her like a shadow she couldn't outrun. Then came a different sound, hoofbeats. Not the slow, tired clip-clop of a farmer's mule, but the confident, ground-eating rhythm of expensive horses. 3 riders, materializing out of the heat haze like devils. The man in the lead sat his horse like he didn't just own the animal, but the very dirt it stood on. Even from a distance she knew. Samuel Brennan, owner of the Double B Ranch, a 40,000-acre kingdom of dust and cattle. His silver conchos flashed like evil little stars. His black hat shadowed a face carved from 50 years of getting exactly what he wanted. He swung down from his horse in front of the general store, his spurs ringing like a death knell on the warped boardwalk. Margaret felt a cold knot in her stomach and turned to go inside, to hide in the gloom of her cabin. But it was too late. Brennan's eyes found her. Across the entire dusty street, his gaze locked onto hers. It wasn't a look of interest or pity. It was a look of assessment, like a rancher sizing up a mare he was thinking of buying. And in that single cold glance, Margaret knew her life was about to get a whole lot worse. She just didn't know how much worse it could possibly get. That evening, the world was painted in shades of orange and purple as Margaret scrubbed other people's grime out of their clothes. Her hands were raw, bleeding from the lye soap. That's when she heard the footsteps. Not the heavy, threatening boot falls of a rancher, but the nervous shuffle of a man who didn't want to be there. Sheriff Watson stood at the edge of her yard, his badge a dull star in the twilight, twisting his hat in his hands like a sinner in church. He couldn't meet her eyes. "Evening, Mrs. Sullivan," he mumbled. "Mr. Brennan. He'd like a word. Asked me to invite you to supper. At the hotel." Margaret's hands stopped moving in the sudsy water. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Supper at the Imperial Hotel? It was the nicest place in 3 counties. "Sheriff, I don't have a thing to wear to a place like that. And my son—" Watson shifted, his discomfort so thick you could taste it. "Mr. Brennan said the boy's welcome too. And ma'am—" He finally looked up and his eyes were full of a terrible pity. "He said to tell you he's not a man who takes no for an answer." The Imperial Hotel smelled like a different world. Roast beef, fresh bread, money. Thomas's eyes were as wide as dinner plates. Crystal glasses sparkled, and the silverware was heavier than anything Margaret had ever held. Samuel Brennan sat across from them, a king on his throne, slicing into a steak with surgical precision. He didn't waste time with small talk. "Your boy needs a father," he said, his voice flat and hard as a granite slab. "You need a home. I need a wife to run my household." He put down his knife and fork and pinned her with his pale blue eyes, eyes that had seen droughts and blizzards and never once blinked. "I'm not a young man, Mrs. Sullivan. I'm not interested in romance. I'm offering security. The boy will have tutors, the best clothes, a future. You'll have servants, dresses from Santa Fe, anything you want." The water she sipped tasted like dust in her throat. "Mr. Brennan, He cut her off. "I know what they say about me. That my first wife died, that the second one ran off. But let's be honest, Mrs. Sullivan. You're not exactly in a position to be picky, are you?" His gaze flickered over her patched dress, then to Thomas, who was happily stuffing a bread roll into his mouth. I had a word with Henderson at the bank. You're 3 months behind on this shack you call a home. Come the first snow, where will you and the boy be? Out on the street. The food in her stomach turned to a cold, heavy stone. She looked out the window at the respectable people of Cedar Ridge walking by, their faces turned away from her, from the widow who was having dinner with the devil. She thought of winter, of Thomas's shivering little body, of the empty pantry. The shame was afire in her cheeks. What? What would you expect of me? She whispered, the words barely making it out. Brennan almost smiled. It was a terrifying sight. A wife's duties. Nothing more, nothing less. My lawyer will draw up the papers, a legal arrangement. I'm prepared to be generous. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. $500 to clear your debts and get you situated. Consider it a signing bonus. $500. It was more money than she'd seen in her entire life. It was a fortune. It was the price of her soul. She looked down at Thomas, who had fallen asleep against her, his small hand still clutching the bread. It was his future, his life. When? She breathed. Saturday, Brennan said, already signaling for the bill. 3 days. The sheriff will escort you to the ranch after the ceremony. It wasn't a proposal. It was a verdict. A business transaction had just been completed, and Margaret was the merchandise. The news hit Cedar Ridge like a lightning strike. The rancher bought himself a bride. The whispers were everywhere now, a constant, humming judgment. Some called her lucky. Others called her a whore. Margaret walked through town with her head held high, a mask of indifference plastered on her face, but inside something was shriveling up and dying. Maybe it was the last piece of the girl who had married James for love. Saturday came, bright and cruel. Margaret stood in her cabin, a stranger in a new gray silk dress Brennan had sent over. It felt less like a wedding gown and more like a shroud. Thomas played at her feet, oblivious. Then a knock. It was Mrs. Watson, the sheriff's wife, holding a small wilting bouquet of desert wildflowers. Thought you might want these, she said, her eyes swimming with a pity that was worse than any scorn. Every bride should have flowers. The ceremony was a joke. Judge Morrison rushed through the words in the courthouse, his face a mask of discomfort. Brennan stood beside her, rigid and impatient, checking his pocket watch as if he had a cattle auction to get to. The only witnesses were Sheriff Watson and Brennan's foreman, a man with a scarred face and dead eyes named Jake Holloway. The words, "Do you, Margaret Sullivan, take this man," echoed in the empty room. She heard a voice say, "I do," and realized with a shock that it was her own. The cold, heavy ring he slid on her finger felt like a manacle. He was told to kiss the bride. He pressed his dry, thin lips to her cheek for a fraction of a second. The deal was sealed. Outside, a small crowd had gathered to watch the spectacle. She heard them plain as day. Bought and paid for. What choice did she have? That poor child. As the wagon rattled toward the Double B, with Thomas asleep in her lap, Margaret watched Cedar Ridge shrink until it was just a smudge on the horizon. Brennan rode up ahead with his foreman, already talking business, already forgetting he'd just acquired a wife. She was just another asset, like a new bull or a parcel of land. The sun began to set, painting the sky in blood red and bruised purple as they arrived at the ranch house. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress of adobe and dark wood, sprawling and menacing under the endless sky. A line of servants waited on the porch, Mexican and Indian women with downcast eyes, a silent Chinese cook. They looked at her with the same caution they'd show a new storm rolling in. They knew the score. They'd seen wives come and go. And as Margaret tucked Thomas into a bed bigger than their whole cabin had been, she looked out the window at the vast, dark empire she now belonged to. Coyotes howled in the distance, a lonely, mournful sound. She wondered if they were crying for her, the freedom she'd just sold for $500 in a gray silk dress. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 10, each chime a hammer blow against the silence. Margaret stood outside the master bedroom, her hands clammy, her heart a trapped bird beating against her ribs. The white silk nightgown Brennan had provided felt cold and foreign against her skin. Through the thick oak door, she could hear the clink of a glass and smell the bitter smoke of his cigar. She didn't even have to knock. Come in, his voice boomed, sharp and impatient. A wife doesn't need permission to enter her husband's room. The room was cavernous, dominated by a huge four-poster bed that looked like a funeral pyre. Brennan sat in a leather armchair by the unlit fireplace, a half-empty tumbler of whiskey in his hand. He hadn't bothered to take off his boots. He was always ready for business. "That's a fine gown," he said, not looking at her, but at her reflection in the dark window pane. He was appraising her, like he was checking the teeth on a horse. "Cost a pretty penny in Santa Fe. Finest French silk," the man said. She stood frozen by the door. "Thomas is asleep. He likes his new room. I don't care about the boy right now," Brennan cut in, his voice like gravel. He set his glass down with a heavy thud and rose to his feet. He crossed the room with slow, deliberate steps, circling her like a predator. "You know why you're here, don't you? I didn't pay $500 for a glorified housekeeper. I have plenty of those." Each word was a slap. She forced herself to stand still, to not flinch. "Turn around," he commanded. The words were flat, devoid of any emotion except ownership. When she hesitated, his voice grew a razor's edge. "I said, turn around. I want to see what I've purchased." Slowly, mechanically, she turned, the bile rising in her throat. She could feel his eyes on her, crawling over her skin, cataloging his investment. It was the most profound humiliation she had ever known. "You'll do," he said finally, his voice laced with a cold satisfaction. "My first wife, Catherine, she was prettier, but weak, died birthing a stillborn. The second one, Maria, she had fire in her. Too much fire. Ran off with some snake oil salesman." He let out a short, ugly laugh that sounded like rocks grinding together. "But you're practical. You're desperate, and desperate women don't run." He stepped in front of her, his shadow swallowing her whole. The smell of whiskey was overpowering. His eyes weren't the eyes of a husband. They were the eyes of a collector admiring a new possession he intended to use. This was it. This was the final clause in their business transaction. And as he reached for her, a piece of ice formed in Margaret's heart. She thought of James, of his gentle hands and kind eyes. She thought of the promise she'd made to herself to protect Thomas, no matter what. His fingers closed on her shoulders like a cage, and she understood with chilling clarity. She hadn't escaped starvation at all. She had just traded a cage made of poverty for one made of gold and silk. And the bars were just as cold. The night was an eternity of cold, methodical duty. Brennan took what he believed he had paid for, with all the passion of a bookkeeper balancing a ledger. When he was finished, he rolled away from her, picked up his whiskey glass, and lit another cigar. He didn't speak to her, didn't even look at her. He just waved a dismissive hand toward the door. "You can sleep in your own room," he grunted. "I'll send for you when I have need of you." She fled, clutching the shreds of her dignity, her bare feet silent on the cold tile floor. Back in her room, a space connected to Thomas's, a luxurious cell, she sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around herself, but no tears came. The well of her sorrow had run dry, leaving only a cold, hard stone of rage. Through the window, the vast, empty darkness of the Double B stretched out to the horizon, a perfect reflection of the emptiness inside her. This wasn't a life. It was a sentence. The next morning, she rose before dawn and scrubbed her skin raw, trying to wash away the memory of his touch. She dressed in a simple day dress and went to the dining room, but Brennan was already there, hunched over paperwork, a mountain of beef and eggs on his plate. He didn't look up. "From now on, you'll take your meals in your room," he ordered. "I conduct business in the morning. I don't require conversation." The housekeeper, Mrs. Rollins, a woman who looked like she'd been pickled in vinegar, appeared as if summoned. Her gray hair was pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch the skin on her face. She gave Margaret a tour of the house, her voice a monotonous drone of contempt. "Mr. Brennan expects order," she sniffed. "You will oversee the domestic staff. You will plan the menus. You will ensure the house is always ready for his associates." She stopped at a heavy oak door at the end of the hall. "This is Mr. Brennan's study. You are never to enter, under any circumstances. He is a man who values his privacy." "I understand," Margaret said, her voice a ghost. For a moment, A flicker of something, pity maybe, crossed the housekeeper's face. "A piece of advice, Mrs. Brennan," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The best way to survive in this house is to become invisible. Cause no trouble. Ask no questions. The less he notices you, the longer you'll last." And so began Margaret's new life as a ghost. She drifted through the sprawling adobe house, a silent observer in her own life. Brennan summoned her to his room 2 more times that week. Each time was the same cold, loveless transaction. During the day, she managed the staff, who watched her with a mixture of fear and pity. They knew. They'd seen it all before. Her only comfort was Thomas. The boy, at least, was thriving. He had enough food, a warm bed. The Chinese cook, Chen Lu, had taken a shine to him, sneaking him sweets from the kitchen. But every time Margaret saw her son smile, a piece of her heart broke, because she knew the price of his happiness. One afternoon, hiding in the shade of the kitchen garden, she overheard 2 ranch hands talking. "Heard the boss tellin' Holloway he got himself a bargain," one of them chuckled. "Cheaper than one of them fancy girls from San Francisco, and a hell of a lot more respectable looking for when the governor comes to visit." The other man spat a stream of tobacco juice. "That's Brennan for you. Never makes a deal unless he comes out on top." A bargain. A respectable-looking bargain. The words coiled in her gut like snakes. The women in Cedar Ridge had called her the bride he paid for, but they didn't know the half of it. She wasn't a wife. She wasn't even a mistress. She was a piece of furniture, a decoration, an investment. That night she stood at her window, staring out at the suffocating darkness. She thought about Maria, the second wife, the one who ran. They called her a fool, but Margaret now saw her as a hero. She had chosen freedom over a gilded cage. But where could a woman with a small child run? She had no money, no allies, no home to run to. She was trapped. Brennan was snoring down the hall, secure in his castle, confident in his purchase. He believed her desperation was a chain that bound her to him forever. But as Margaret looked up at the cold, distant stars, a tiny, dangerous ember of an idea began to glow in the darkness of her mind. He was wrong. Desperation wasn't a chain. It was a whetstone, and it was making her sharp. In the bottom drawer of her dresser, beneath the fancy silk things he'd bought her, she began to build a new future, one secret at a time. A coin found on the floor, a piece of dried beef from the kitchen, a small folded map of the territory she'd found tucked away in a book in the library. She was done being a ghost. She was going to become a thief, and she was going to steal her life back. The moon was a sliver of bone in the black velvet sky. Perfect darkness. For 3 weeks, Margaret had planned, hoarded, and prayed. Now the house slept around her, a slumbering beast. In a canvas sack slung over her shoulder, she carried their future. Dried meat, hardtack biscuits, 2 canteens of water, and $37. A king's ransom, pieced together from forgotten coins and bills skimmed from the household accounts. Thomas was a warm, trusting weight on her back, his small arms wrapped tightly around her neck. He thought they were going on an adventure. He had no idea. She had chosen tonight with the precision of a general planning an attack. Brennan was in Tucson, trying to swindle some other poor soul, and he'd taken most of his men. The skeleton crew left behind were loud and drunk in the bunkhouse. Their laughter was her cover. The kitchen door let out a single heart-stopping creak as she slipped into the cool night. The air tasted of freedom. She had walked the route in her mind 100 times. South toward Skeleton Creek, then west, following the water toward the mountains and the old Apache trails. They had to walk. Stealing a horse was too noisy, too risky. 15 miles to the next trading post. 15 miles on foot, carrying a child. It seemed impossible, but staying was a death sentence. They'd been walking for what felt like hours, maybe 3 miles, when Thomas started to cry. It was a small whimpering sound, but in the dead silence of the desert, it sounded like a scream. "Hush, my love," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "It's just a game, remember?" But the game was over. He was tired and scared. She pushed on, fear afire at her heels. Every rustle in the sagebrush was one of Brennan's men. Every shadow was a pursuer. By the time the first hint of gray touched the eastern sky, they had reached the edge of the Double B. A broken fence post marked the border between her prison and the terrifying, beautiful unknown. For a single, breathtaking moment, she felt a surge of hope. She was free. But the desert doesn't care about hope. By midday, the sun was a malevolent eye in the sky, burning away her foolish optimism. Their water was nearly gone. Her strength was failing. Thomas had gone limp and quiet in her arms, his lips cracked and dry. The trading post was a mirage miles away. She stumbled into a dry wash, collapsing in the meager shade of a limestone overhang. Her hands trembled as she poured the last few precious drops of water into her son's mouth. She had saved him from Brennan only to lead him to a slower, crueler death in the wilderness. She had failed. She closed her eyes and prayed for a quick end. That's when she heard it. Horses, not the heavy tread of American breds, but the light, quick steps of ponies, and voices, speaking a language that was ancient and sharp. Margaret clutched Thomas to her chest, ready to face Brennan's men, ready to beg. But when the riders appeared on the rim of the wash, her blood ran cold. They weren't cowboys. They were Apache. 5 of them, their faces painted for war, rifles held with casual menace. The stories she'd heard in Cedar Ridge flashed through her mind. Stories of raids, of settlers killed, of women and children taken. This was it. This was the end. The warriors conferred in their own tongue, their dark eyes taking in the pathetic sight of the white woman and her dying child. One of them, older, with gray in his long black hair, gestured dismissively. Leave them. But another one, younger, with 3 parallel scars cut into his cheek, looked at Thomas. Something in his expression changed. He argued with the older warrior, his voice sharp and insistent. The argument grew heated. The young warrior would not back down. Finally, the older man spat in the dust, wheeled his pony around, and seemed to give in. The young Apache dismounted and approached her slowly, cautiously. He pointed a finger at his own chest. "Kuruk," he said. He gestured to her. "Margaret," she rasped. "My son. Thomas." Kuruk nodded. Then he spoke in broken, halting English. "You come. No hurt." He pointed to his horse. "Woman sick, child sick. You die here." It wasn't a question, it was a fact. He lifted Thomas, who was too weak to even be afraid, and placed him gently on the front of his saddle. Then he helped Margaret mount behind them, her arms instinctively wrapping around her son and this strange, scarred savior. They rode for what felt like days, through canyons and over ridges she never could have found on her own. As the sun bled across the horizon, they descended into a hidden valley. Smoke curled from a cluster of wickiups, dome-shaped huts of branches and grass. Their arrival caused an uproar. An old woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles and authority, confronted Kuruk, her words like thrown knives. He replied calmly, gesturing to Margaret and the sickly child. Margaret was a piece of meat being fought over by wolves. She saw one man make a throat-slitting gesture, but Kuruk was immovable. And when he lifted Thomas down from the horse, the boy's frail, dust-covered body seemed to silence the harshest voices. The old woman, Nalan, Kuruk called her, finally gave a curt nod. She barked an order, and 2 women led Margaret to a small wickiup on the edge of the camp. It was a prisoner's hut. Kuruk appeared at the doorway a short time later with a bowl of thin gruel. "For boy," he said, "make strong." Margaret looked up at him, her mind reeling. "Why?" she asked, the word cracking in her dry throat. "Why are you helping us?" Kuruk's gaze went distant, lost in a painful memory. He looked at Thomas, sleeping fitfully on a buffalo robe. "I have sister," he said, the English words stiff and unfamiliar in his mouth. "Soldiers take. She's small, like him, maybe dead, maybe slave." He turned and left without another word. Through the opening of the hut, Margaret watched the Apache camp settle for the night. Families gathered around fires. Children played. It was a community bound by hardship and love, and she was their prisoner. But as she held her son, who was already stirring with a bit more life, she realized the terrible irony. She had run from a civilized man who treated her like an animal, only to be rescued by a so-called savage who saw her as a human being. Guards were posted outside her hut. She was not free, but for the first time in a long, long time, she felt a flicker of something that wasn't despair. Brennan would be looking for her, His rage would be biblical. He would send men, trackers, maybe even soldiers. Her presence here put this entire village in danger. And yet Kuruk had saved her. He had defied his own people for a white woman and her child. It made no sense. But as she lay back, listening to the low rhythmic chanting of the Apache, she knew one thing for sure. The woman Samuel Brennan had bought and paid for was dead. She had died out there in the desert. Whoever was left, whatever she would become here, in this strange and dangerous new world, would be her own creation. The Apache camp was a world of unspoken rules. Suspicion was the air they breathed, and trust was a currency Margaret didn't have. The women who brought her food would avoid her gaze, placing baskets of nuts and dried meat on the ground, and backing away as if she carried a disease. Only the children were bold, their dark eyes following her every move. Kuruk was her only link to this new reality. He came each morning, bringing herbs for Thomas and teaching Margaret Apache words. He taught her gohuea for coffee, tu for water, and shash for bear. The sound of it made Thomas laugh, a real bubbling laugh that felt like a miracle. After 4 days, the old matriarch, Naline, entered their wickiup. Her eyes were like chips of obsidian, sharp and missing nothing. She spoke for a long time, her voice a gravelly torrent, while a younger woman named Ayana translated. Nalan says you cannot be a stone here. You cannot be useless. Apache women work. You will work, or you will leave. The threat was clear, but then came the offer. She says, you will teach. The white man marks. The letters. Margaret's head snapped up. Teach? I can do that. I can teach reading, writing. A deal was struck. Margaret would grind mesquite pods until her hands bled, and in return, she would teach the Apache children how to read the language of their enemies. It was a strange bargain, but it was a beginning. It was a way to earn her place. Life fell into a rhythm. The men hunted, the women worked, and Margaret found herself becoming a part of it. She learned to listen to the silence of the desert, to read the signs in the dust. The women slowly, grudgingly, began to accept her. Ayana would correct her grip on the grinding stone. An older woman showed her which roots were for medicine and which were poison. Thomas, meanwhile, was flourishing. He ran with the Apache boys, his skin browning under the sun, his laughter echoing through the small valley. He followed Kuruk like a shadow, his eyes wide with hero worship. Margaret watched them one evening, a knot of gratitude and fear in her chest. He is smart, Kuruk said, sitting beside her. Learns fast. Good hunter one day. He's all I have, Margaret said softly. No, Kuruk said, his gaze fixed on the fire. You have yourself? You have a choice. My sister, Diani, she had no choice. It was the first time he had said her name. The story came out in broken pieces, like shards of a broken pot. Soldiers had come to their village 3 winters ago. They'd been falsely accused of raids. It was an excuse. They take the children, he said, his voice low and full of a cold, ancient anger, for the schools, to make them civilized. They cut her hair, took her name, beat her for speaking our words. He looked at Margaret, and for the first time she saw the depth of the wound he carried. We heard nothing for a year. Then a man who escaped told us, she got sick, the coughing sickness. They have a graveyard for the children who do not become civilized enough. Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. The boarding schools. She'd heard whispers of them, places of unimaginable cruelty disguised as progress. I'm so sorry, Kuruk. Sorry does not bring her back, he said, standing up. But justice is a different story. He looked towards the north, in the direction of the Double B Ranch. The man who led the soldiers, the one who paid them to clear the land of us. He had pale blue eyes, like a snake. He built a great house on the land where my people are buried. A cold dread washed over Margaret. Pale blue eyes. A great house. Samuel Brennan. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a collision. Her monster was his monster too. She had not just stumbled into a random Apache camp. She had been delivered, by fate or by chance, into the heart of a war she knew nothing about. Kuruk looked down at her, his scarred face illuminated by the firelight. His expression was unreadable, but his next words would change everything. You said you found a map in his library, he stated, not a question. You said he kept papers in his study. What did you see? Suddenly, her escape wasn't just about her and Thomas anymore. It was about Diane. It was about justice. And the few scraps of paper she had stolen from Brennan's desk might be more powerful than any gun. She was no longer a victim running from a monster. She was a witness. Margaret's mind raced, replaying the frantic moments in Brennan's study. It was more than just a map. In her desperate search for cash, she had stuffed a handful of papers into her sack without even looking at them. Now she pulled them out, her hands trembling. Under the flickering firelight, she and Kuruk spread them on a buffalo hide. There were deeds, contracts, and a ledger, its columns filled with Brennan's precise, spidery handwriting. Much of it was just ranch business, but then Kuruk pointed to a series of entries. Payments, large sums, made out to a Captain J. Edwards, U.S. Cavalry. The dates corresponded with the time Kuruk's sister was taken, and next to the entries were notes. Land clearance. Hostile mitigation. It wasn't proof, not in a white man's court, but for the Apache it was everything. It was the missing piece of their grief. Brennan hadn't just profited from their tragedy, he had orchestrated it. He had paid American soldiers to clear his land, to steal their children. This is not enough, Kuruk said, his voice tight. White man's court will say this is business. They will not see the blood. What if there's more? Margaret whispered. In his study, he forbade me from ever entering. Mrs. Rollins, the housekeeper, she said he was very particular about it. There must be something else in there. Something he's hiding. A crazy, impossible idea began to form in her mind. An idea so dangerous it stole her breath. I have to go back. Kuruk looked at her as if she'd lost her mind. Go back. He will kill you. He'll kill me if he finds me out here anyway, she argued, a new hard strength rising in her. He thinks I'm a desperate, stupid woman who ran into the desert to die. He won't be expecting me to come back. I can get in. I know the house, the routines. I know where the servants sleep. I can get into that study. It was suicide, a moth flying back into the flame. But she thought of Thomas, sleeping peacefully in the wickiup. She thought of Diane, buried in an unmarked grave at a school designed to erase her. This wasn't just about running anymore. It was about fighting back. I won't go alone, Kuruk said, his decision made. But we cannot ride into his yard. He has too many men, too many guns. We won't have to, Margaret said. She pointed to a name that appeared over and over in the ledger, next to deliveries of supplies and equipment. Jake Holloway, the foreman, the man with the dead eyes and the scarred face who had stood as a witness at her wedding. There's something about him, she said, thinking back. He never smiled. He watched Brennan with, not fear, something else, contempt. What if the foreman wasn't the loyal dog he appeared to be? What if he was just waiting for his moment? It was a wild gamble, a shot in the absolute dark. They needed an ally on the inside. They needed Jake Holloway. Kuruk dispatched 2 of his best scouts, silent as shadows, to watch the Double-B. Their mission was not to attack, but to observe, and if possible, to make contact with the foreman, away from the ranch and away from Brennan's watchful eyes. The days that followed were a torment of waiting. Margaret threw herself into her new life, teaching the children their letters by day, her mind 1,000 miles away, back in her gilded cage. She showed Nalan and the other women Brennan's signature on the documents. This is his mark, she explained. This is how he steals your land with a pen instead of a gun. For the first time, she saw respect in the old woman's eyes. One evening, a week later, the scouts returned. They had found Holloway alone, checking a remote line of fence. They had approached with caution, and Holloway hadn't raised his rifle. He had listened. The message he sent back was 3 simple words. The North Pasture, midnight. It was a trap. It had to be a trap. Why would Brennan's right-hand man agree to meet with them? But as Margaret looked into Kuruk's determined eyes, she knew they had no other choice. They had to take the risk. That night, under a moonless sky, Margaret, Kuruk, and 2 other warriors rode out of the hidden valley. Margaret was no longer the frightened widow who had fled into the desert. She was dressed in buckskin, her hair braided like an Apache woman's. She was riding back to confront the devil himself, and this time, she was not alone. The meeting spot was a desolate stretch of land, dotted with skeletal mesquite trees. They saw a lone figure by a small fire, Jake Holloway. He stood as they approached, his hand resting near the pistol on his hip. His scarred face was impossible to read in the flickering light. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met, or the biggest fool," he said, his voice a low rasp. He wasn't looking at Margaret. He was looking at Kuruk. "Brennan's offering $500 for her return. 1,000 if she's dead." "We are not here for money," Kuruk said, his voice cold. Holloway finally turned his gaze to Margaret. "What do you want?" "The rest of the papers in his study," Margaret said, her voice steady. "The real ledgers, the ones that prove what he did." Holloway let out a short, harsh laugh. "Why in God's name would I help you? He signs my pay." Margaret took a step forward. "Because of Maria." The name hung in the air between them. Holloway's hand tightened on his pistol. His face, for the first time, showed a flicker of emotion, a deep, burning pain. "What do you know about Maria?" "Brennan said she ran off," Margaret said quietly. "But the servants whisper. They say you two were close. They say she wouldn't have just left." Not without a word. Holloway stared into the fire, his shoulders slumping. The tough foreman facade crumbled, revealing the broken man beneath. "She was my cousin," he said, his voice thick with a grief he had hidden for years. "She hated him. She was going to leave him, but she was going to expose him first. She found his real books, the ones that show everything, the land grabs, the bribes, the payments to the cavalry." He looked up, his eyes filled with a terrible, chilling certainty. "She didn't run off. He killed her. I know he did. Buried her somewhere out on this damn ranch where no one will ever find her." The final piece of the puzzle slotted into place. Brennan wasn't just a monster, he was a murderer. And his loyal foreman had been waiting for years for a chance at revenge. "He keeps the real ledgers in a safe, hidden behind a map of the territory on his study wall," Holloway said. "He's back from Tucson tomorrow night. He'll be drunk and passed out by midnight. The house will be quiet. That's your only chance." He looked from Margaret to Kuruk, a grim alliance forged in the desert night. "I'll deal with the dogs. I'll make sure the hands in the bunkhouse stay put. But getting in the house and getting into that safe, that's on you." He was handing them the key to the fortress. But walking through that door meant facing the dragon in his lair. One mistake, one sound, and they would all end up in unmarked graves right next to Maria. The ride back to the Double B was a silent, nerve-wracking journey through a landscape of memories. Every rock, every twisted juniper tree reminded Margaret of her desperate flight. But this time, she wasn't running away. She was riding into the heart of the storm. They left the horses with two warriors a mile from the ranch house and crept forward on foot, shadows moving through bigger shadows. The house was a dark monolith against the star-dusted sky. A single lamp burned in an upstairs window. Brennan's window. Kuruk laid a hand on Margaret's arm, his touch steady and reassuring. Holloway's signal came, the hoot of an owl, once, then twice. It was time. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she led Kuruk to the kitchen door she had fled through weeks before. It was unlocked, just as Holloway had promised. They slipped inside, into the familiar smells of polish and stale cigar smoke. The house was dead quiet, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a countdown to discovery. They moved like ghosts, their moccasin-clad feet silent on the tile. Margaret's knowledge of the house was their only map. Past the dining room, down the long hall, to the one place she had been forbidden to go. The study. The door was locked. Of course it was locked. Margaret pulled a thin piece of metal from her belt, a corset stay she had flattened and filed into a crude lockpick. Her hands shook as she worked it into the keyhole, the skills of a thief coming back to her. Minutes felt like hours. The metallic click of the tumblers giving way sounded as loud as a gunshot in the silence. They were in. The study smelled of leather, whiskey, and power. A massive desk dominated the room, but their target was on the wall, a large frame map of the New Mexico territory. Margaret's hands trembled as she lifted it from its hook. Behind it, just as Holloway had said, was the black iron face of a safe. "He thinks he is so clever," Kuruk whispered, examining the combination dial. "Numbers are a white man's trap." He pulled a small, hardened piece of steel from his belt and a deerskin pouch. He placed his ear against the cold metal of the safe, his fingers delicate on the dial, listening for the faint clicks of the tumblers. Margaret stood watch at the door, her ears straining for any sound, any sign that they had been discovered. The house remained silent. Kuruk worked with an intense, focused patience she had never seen before. Finally, after an eternity, there was a heavy, satisfying thud as the locking mechanism released. He swung the heavy door open. Inside were stacks of paper, bound ledgers, and bags of gold coins. But one book stood out. It was smaller than the others, bound in dark red leather. Kuruk handed it to her. Margaret opened it. The first page read, S. Brennan, Private Accounts. She flipped through the pages. It was all there. Names, dates, amounts. Bribes to territorial officials, payments to Sheriff Watson, and a detailed accounting of the money paid to Captain Edwards for the mitigation of the Apache, clearing the way for the Double B to expand. There were even diagrams, crude maps showing where the bodies of homesteaders who had refused to sell were buried. This was it. This was the key that would bring his kingdom crashing down. But as Margaret closed the book, a floorboard creaked in the hallway upstairs. They both froze. Heavy, slightly unsteady footsteps were coming down the main staircase. Brennan. He was awake. They were trapped. Kuruk grabbed the ledger and a bag of coins, shoving them into his satchel. He looked at Margaret, his eyes dark and urgent. There was no time to put the map back. No time to close the safe. They had to get out. Now. They slipped out of the study, melting back into the shadows of the hallway, just as Brennan reached the bottom of the stairs. He was in his nightshirt, a pistol in one hand and a bottle of whiskey in the other. He swayed slightly, muttering to himself. He was heading for the study, for his safe. For a moment, Margaret thought they were clear, but then he stopped. He sniffed the air. He turned his head, his pale blue eyes narrowing as he stared directly into the darkness where they were hiding. He couldn't see them, but he knew. He knew someone was there. "Who's there?" he growled, raising the pistol. "Show yourself!" Silence. Margaret held her breath, praying he would dismiss it as a drunken fancy. But Brennan was a predator. His instincts were sharp. He took a step toward them. Then another. The massive grandfather clock began to chime, marking the hour of 1. On the second chime, Kuruk moved. He didn't run for the door. He did the last thing Brennan would ever expect. He lunged out of the darkness, not at Brennan, but at the base of the towering clock. With a grunt of effort, he heaved the massive piece of furniture forward. Brennan yelled in surprise as the clock toppled toward him. He fired his pistol wildly, the shot tearing a chunk of plaster from the ceiling as he dove out of the way. The clock crashed to the floor with a sound like the world ending, its chimes dying in a discordant clang of broken metal. In that chaotic moment of noise and confusion, Kuruk grabbed Margaret's hand and pulled her toward the kitchen. "Go! Now!" he yelled. Lights were coming on in the bunkhouse. Men were shouting. The entire ranch was waking up. They burst out the kitchen door and into the night, running for their lives, the red ledger clutched in Margaret's hand. They had the proof, but they had also awakened the dragon. And now he knew their faces. There would be no more hiding. This was no longer a secret war. It was about to become a slaughter. They ran, fueled by adrenaline and terror, the shouts from the ranch house growing fainter behind them. They reached the warriors and the horses, leaping into their saddles and tearing off into the desert, not looking back. The red ledger felt like it was burning a hole through Margaret's satchel. It was their salvation and their death warrant, all in one. Back at the hidden valley, the camp was in an uproar. Kuruk quickly explained what had happened. They had the proof, but Brennan was now on the hunt. He wouldn't just send a few trackers this time. He would come with an army. He would wipe them out to protect his secrets. Nalan, the old matriarch, listened intently, her face grim. When Kuruk finished, she looked at Margaret, then at the ledger in her hands. "This book is white man's magic," she said, Ayana translating. "It can kill him, but he will try to kill us first." Panic began to ripple through the camp. Some argued they should flee, run into the mountains where Brennan could never find them. Others, their faces hard with anger, wanted to fight, to meet Brennan's men head-on. But Kuruk silenced them. "We cannot run forever," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "and we cannot fight his army alone. We will use his own weapons against him. We will use his law." The plan was desperate. Kuruk, Margaret, and a small band of warriors would ride for Santa Fe. It was a journey of over 100 miles through hostile territory. They would take the ledger to the territorial governor, to the federal marshals. They would expose Brennan for the murderer and thief he was. But what about the rest of the tribe? They couldn't come, but they couldn't stay. They would be sitting ducks. That's when a new, unexpected voice spoke up. Jake Holloway. He had ridden in shortly after them, having fled the ranch when the shooting started. "He'll be coming for you," Holloway said, his face grim. "But I can slow him down. I know his tactics. I know which passes he'll use. I can send him on a few wild goose chases, buy you a day, maybe two." It was a suicide mission for him. If he was caught, Brennan would show him no mercy. But Holloway's eyes were filled with a cold, clear purpose. This was his penance, his revenge for Maria. The tribe agreed. The women, children, and old men, led by Nolan, would pack up the camp and move to a secret, high-altitude location in the Dragoon Mountains, a place known only to the Apache. Holloway would lead Brennan's posse astray, and Margaret and Kuruk would ride for justice. They left at dawn. As Margaret rode out of the valley, Thomas held tightly in front of her. She looked back at the people who had become her family. They were entrusting their lives to her, to a book filled with a rich man's secrets. The journey was grueling. They rode hard, pushing the horses to their limits, sleeping for only a few hours at a time. The desert was their enemy now, vast and unforgiving. On the third day they saw it, a pillar of dust on the horizon behind them. Brennan's posse. Holloway's diversions hadn't held them for long. They were gaining. "They have better horses," Kuruk said, his face a mask of stone. "They will catch us before we reach the city." Hope began to dwindle. They were in open country with nowhere to hide. Brennan was going to run them to ground and slaughter them like animals. But Kuruk hadn't survived this long without knowing every secret of the land. He veered their course, heading not for the flat plains toward Santa Fe, but for a jagged line of black volcanic rock to the west, a place the settlers called the Devil's Jawbone. "He will not follow us in there," Kuruk said. "The land will kill his horses. We go on foot." It was their only chance. They rode the horses until the animals were lathered and trembling, then dismounted at the edge of the Badlands. They released the tired mounts, giving them a slap to send them running, hopefully creating a false trail. Then, with Thomas on Kuruk's back, they plunged into the labyrinth of razor-sharp rock and shadowed canyons. The Devil's Jawbone was a nightmare landscape. The sun beat down on the black rock until the heat was a physical blow. The ground was treacherous, covered in loose scree that could send a man tumbling into a ravine. Their water ran low. Thomas began to weaken, his small body listless with heat and exhaustion. Margaret felt despair closing in. They had come so far, only to die here, in this God-forsaken place. They found shelter in a small cave as the sun began to set. Kuruk shared the last of the water between Margaret and Thomas. His own lips were cracked and bleeding. "He will be waiting for us," Margaret whispered, her voice hoarse. "On the other side." "Yes," Kuruk said, "but he thinks we are trapped. He will not expect us to fight." He opened his satchel and began checking his rifle, his movements calm and deliberate. There was no fear in him, only resolve. Margaret looked at the red ledger, still wrapped securely in her bag. It felt so useless now, a book of words against a dozen rifles. As darkness fell, a new sound echoed through the canyons. Not horses, not men. A wolf, a long, lonely howl. Then it was answered, from another direction and another. Soon the entire labyrinth was filled with the sound, but it wasn't wolves. Kuruk looked at Margaret, a rare, fierce smile on his scarred face. "My people," he said. "Holloway did more than slow Brennan down. He sent word." Nolan had not run to the mountains. She had sent every warrior she had. They hadn't abandoned their war chief. They had come to surround the hunters. The tables had just turned. Brennan thought he had them trapped in the Devil's Jawbone. He had no idea he was the one who had just walked into the cage. The Apache warriors moved through the treacherous rocks like spirits, silent and unseen. They took up positions along the rim of the canyons, surrounding Brennan's posse, who were camped carelessly at the entrance to the Badlands, confident their prey was trapped. Margaret and Kuruk waited in the darkness of their cave, listening to the signals, the call of a night bird, the snap of a twig, that told them the trap was set. The plan was not a massacre, it was something smarter. Justice. Just before dawn, when the air was cold and the men were groggy from sleep, a single rider emerged from the rocks. It was not a warrior. It was Margaret. She rode a pony one of the Apache had brought her, holding the red ledger high in the air. The men in the camp scrambled for their rifles, their faces a mixture of shock and confusion. Brennan stepped out of his tent, his face a thundercloud of rage. "Witch!" he bellowed. "I should have known you were in league with them savages." "It's over, Brennan," Margaret called out, her voice clear and strong, echoing off the canyon walls. "I have your book, your real book. It's all in here. Maria, the homesteaders, the money you paid to have children stolen from their families." A murmur went through the posse. Most of them were just hired guns, loyal only to money. They had signed on to track a runaway wife, not to be accomplices in a federal crime. Sheriff Watson, who was standing beside Brennan, turned pale. "She's bluffing," Brennan roared. "Shoot her!" But before any of his men could raise their rifles, a new voice cut through the air. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Jake Holloway stepped out from behind a boulder, his own rifle leveled squarely at Brennan's chest. "She's not bluffing, Samuel. I saw the books myself. Maria showed them to me before you killed her." Brennan's eyes widened in disbelief at the betrayal. "Holloway, you traitorous dog!" "It's over," Holloway said, his voice cold as ice. "It's all over." And then, as if from the very rocks themselves, the Apache warriors rose. They appeared on every ledge, every ridgeline, rifles and bows aimed down at the terrified posse. They were surrounded, outnumbered, with nowhere to run. The hired guns threw down their weapons immediately. This wasn't their fight, but Brennan was not a man who surrendered. With a guttural roar of fury, he raised his pistol, not at Margaret, but at Holloway, the man who had betrayed him. But he never fired. An arrow, silent and swift, flew from the cliffs above and buried itself in Brennan's gun hand. He screamed, dropping the pistol. Kuruk stepped out of the shadows, his face implacable as stone. He walked directly up to the wounded, sputtering rancher. He did not raise a weapon. He simply looked Brennan in the eye. "My sister's name was Diane," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the stillness of the dawn. "This is her justice." At that moment, another group of riders appeared, not Apache. These were uniformed men, federal marshals, led by a man with a grim, determined face. Holloway's message had not only gone to the Apache, he had sent a rider on the fastest horse to Santa Fe 2 days ago. The law had arrived. Samuel Brennan and Sheriff Watson were put in chains. The posse was disarmed and taken into custody. As the marshals led Brennan away, his empire crumbling around him, he stared at Margaret, his eyes burning with a hatred that was terrifying in its intensity. "You," he spat, "a $500 bride. You've ruined me." Margaret looked back at him, not with fear, but with a calm, steely resolve. She thought of the desperate, starving woman she had been. "You didn't buy a bride, Mr. Brennan," she said. "You bought a witness." The aftermath was a whirlwind. The Red Ledger told its story, and the foundations of power in the New Mexico territory were shaken. Brennan's land was seized by the federal government. Many of the Apache families, with the proof from the ledger and Margaret's testimony, were able to petition for the return of some of their ancestral lands. The story of the bought bride of Cedar Ridge who brought down a tyrant became a legend. Margaret was offered a chance to return to that world, to be a hero, but she had found her home. A few months later, she stood on a ridge overlooking a new valley, a place of peace for Kuruk's people. Thomas, chattering away in a mixture of English and Apache, played nearby with his friends. Kuruk stood beside her. "You could go back," he said. "Be a rich woman. Give the boy a white man's life." Margaret smiled, watching her son. He was happy. He was free. He was home. "Why would I do that?" she asked. We already have everything we need right here. She was no longer Margaret Sullivan, the poor widow. She was no longer Mrs. Brennan, the purchased wife. She was Margaret of the Ionian, the people who had saved her, the family she had chosen. She had walked through the fire and come out the other side, not burned, but forged into something stronger. She had found that some things can't be bought, and freedom, once you truly taste it, is worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The story of Samuel Brennan shows that evil often wears a respectable coat, but the truth, no matter how deep you bury it, always finds a way to the surface. It's a reminder that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being terrified and doing what's right anyway. If you believe in the power of one person to make a difference, and if you enjoyed this story of survival and justice, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button for more tales of the unexpected. And let me know in the comments, what would you have done in Margaret's shoes?